right, good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many visitors with us this Lord's Day. I know the Wilmers had their Christmas yesterday, so it's great to see the family in town. Great to have the McPhersons with us. We're looking forward to a lesson this morning from David McPherson. So if you hadn't heard, we have him in town visiting. Good to see a good number of our own here. I know there's a few who are out as well. So let's go to God in prayer, and then we're going to dive into our study of the very closing chapters in the book of Genesis. Let's pray. All right, like I said, we're getting into the last couple of chapters. A bit of logistics before we do that. We actually have 2 more class periods after this week. This is a strange quarter where there's actually 14 Sundays. I'll be out next week. It'll be Christmas Eve, so I'm sure quite a few will be traveling. So Norma is going to cover the class. And so you might have noticed that this week's lesson has two sides. So the back is not required for this morning, but it's something you'll want to look over for our discussion that will start next week. But we'll probably, as we've been doing, kind of finishing up the prior week's lesson, we'll probably be using some of that review in week 14, and I will be back for that on New Year's Eve. And then in the new quarter, we'll be moving into Exodus. So I put this slide up here. Gil said, that didn't look right. That must be for the kids' class. And I said, no, it is. Actually, Bonnie was sitting next to me preparing for her class, and she found this worksheet, and I thought, man, that's a better depiction of what these 12 tribes came to be known for than anything I had. And so if you as an adult don't know what those pictures mean, then, well, there's some value there in trying to remember those things. And we'll go through that. Of course, these come from Jacob's blessings upon his 12 sons and how he blesses each one of them in different ways. Last week, we mentioned Hosea 11 and verse 1, which says, out of Egypt I called my son, right? In fact, the full quotation from Hosea 11 says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And so very plainly in the context, who's that son that he's calling out? It's Jacob, it's Israel. And he's speaking of his people. He sent them to Egypt and then calls them out. In many ways, as we've taught through Genesis now, I see it more and more as a prequel to the rest of the story, right? You think of the days of Moses, and he's writing the law of Moses, and that generation would want to know, how did we get here, right? Up to this point where we're in Egypt, in need of salvation, in slavery. And so Moses writes these things to explain, how is it that I came into Egypt? And it's just so interesting to see as we close the book of Genesis where it ends, right? Just brings them right up to the end of Joseph's life, where Jacob dies, Joseph dies, and they're left in this land. And it's interesting, Brother Waldron brings out, you start to see some indications of a little bit of a hostile environment in the contrast between Jacob's death and how the Egyptians do great things for him, but then Joseph dies, and there's not a whole lot of procession, not a whole lot of reverence for Joseph, because a lot of time had already started to pass since he had done such great things for Egypt. And so it sets up the book of Exodus so well. Yes, and then of course, out of Egypt I called my son is used for Jesus. Matthew points to it as a prophetic text, that this was to fulfill what was spoken of in Hosea, that out of Egypt I called my son, because Jesus and Mary and Joseph had to flee to Egypt as well. And so there's a parallel, and Jesus becomes that second son who becomes the firstborn, chosen by God to bring salvation to all, a pattern that we've seen repeatedly in these lessons as well. So just a couple of questions we'll hit on from last week's lesson. This is going back into chapter 47 and 48 a little bit. Of course, Joseph has saved the entire region. God has saved the entire region through Joseph by giving him the dream, giving Pharaoh a dream that Joseph could interpret, and now Joseph gives the interpretation and becomes the second in command in Egypt and saves them from this famine. And so at the tail end of that story, of course, many came to Egypt to buy grain, and they were saved as a result. But when they run out of money, you see that they come and have to continue buying grain with whatever they have left. So what is it that they use when they run out of money?
Livestock.
I heard a couple things. I heard land, livestock, one other thing. Themselves. That's right. So this is chapter 47, verses 13 through 19, right? The people come. Notice what it says in verse 14. Genesis 47:14. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain that which they bought. And so then they come and say, we have no money left, give us food. We're going to die if we don't get some food somehow. And so they're willing to give literally everything they have, which enriches the nation of Egypt. Imagine gathering every dollar and cent in the country and in the neighboring country. And so that's the wealth of Egypt created right there. But then they acquire all the land. Brother Waldron mentions the evidence or the proof or corroboration of God's word that this idea that the Egyptians leased their land from Pharaoh is well attested to in history. And so here's where it starts. Because they had to sell their land to Joseph, and then Joseph basically leases it back to them. And what was the tax that he imposes?
1/5.
1/5, 20%. Does that sound like a high tax bracket? I wouldn't want to be in the 20% tax bracket. That would be tough, but everybody had to give 20%. But in essence, the 80% was a gift, right? Because they had sold it all to Pharaoh. It was all Joseph's. He could have said, give me all your grain that you grow. But no, he says, you can have the 80%, and we just need the 20. So pretty kind in that way, I believe. So you can see how that's going to enrich the nation of Egypt. And then leaping forward a little bit, when the Exodus happens, what does Israel do on their way out the door? They plunder Egypt. And so it's God's providence. He's setting his people up for a great, they're going to be made very wealthy even as they leave. And so you see once again just this very specific case of what God says that he does. He raises up nations and he brings them back to their knees. And so here it's very specific actions. So it's not so much providence as it is miracles. But he does the same thing through providence time and time again. He rules in the realm of mankind. And so Egypt is enriched as a result. I wanted to skip question 5. Question 6, we'll come to that in a moment, is getting on to the story of the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh. And so Joseph, recognizes, and Jacob recognizes he's about to die. And so he wants to bless his sons, and he starts with Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh are brought to him. This is chapter 48. And who's the older of these two boys? Manasseh. And even we are more commonly saying Ephraim and Manasseh than Manasseh and Ephraim. And it's because Jacob, it says, put Ephraim before Manasseh. And so verse 20, this pronouncement is made. Verse 20, it says, he blessed them. Chapter 48, verse 20. I know we're moving quickly through these chapters. He blessed them that day, saying, by you, Israel, will pronounce blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And I was actually noticing there are Jewish traditions to this day that use that blessing on their families and on their children. May you be like Ephraim and Manasseh. It's just this way of letting a person know you hope that God blesses their family. And so it's a result of what God has done. So explain to me and to the class how this is the receiving of the birthright. It doesn't specifically say that, but how is that what the birthright represents? No?
Well, the firstborn was supposed to get the double portion. And so when he talks in here about give one portion, and down in verse 22 of chapter 48, starts talking about.
Right, one portion more than your brothers. Okay? Yeah, that's the point I wanted you to see, that a birthright receives a double portion. So if you have 12 sons, rather than dividing your property 12 ways, you divide it 13 ways and give 2 to the oldest. So he gets double. He says here, what does he do to change the family, in a sense?
Blesses the youngest.
He blesses the youngest, certainly. What else?
Considers them his sons.
Right. So Ephraim and Manasseh are now mine. He says, you can have other children and those sons will be yours, but these two are mine. And so he's taken Ephraim and Manasseh as his own. So how many sons does Jacob now have? 13, right? Well, 14 if you count Joseph. He's still got Joseph. But essentially he's saying, this, instead of there being Joseph A and Joseph B portions in the land, there's going to be these two called Ephraim and Manasseh. And that's how we're going to see the tribes, and we'll talk about the tribes in great detail as we continue on through our Bibles. But I thought this colorful depiction of the 12 tribes in the land kind of helps to show that. What tribes stand out on the map? Manasseh has the biggest chunk of land. Milo was asking last night, well, I thought he didn't get he wasn't the one that was chosen. I said, well, it must not correlate. God must not be measuring it in how much land you get, as far as whether or not you're the firstborn or the chosen one. So a couple of details about that, right? Why does he end up with this big chunk over here? Somebody recall? We're going to study that as we get into Joshua.
Because of their occupation, they were the herders, and they needed the extra land along with these other two tribes on the way.
Well, I didn't know that. No, that may be the reason. I didn't realize that. But I was just thinking about these three. The promised land is to the left of this Jordan River, right? These three chunks of land are really not in the promised land. But they conquered these peoples as they came through, and so they asked, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh are asking for this good land. And the agreement is from Joshua, well, as long as you come with us and help us conquer the land that God promised, then you can go back and have it. So, yeah, a half-tribe ends up with this huge territory, but then they also receive a portion, the other half, within the land. But Ephraim, here kind of on the border between the southern tribes and the northern tribes, it was noted in the book, that's going to become kind of a second name for the entire northern 10 tribes at some point. So Ephraim here being chosen as the one who receives the greater blessing above Manasseh becomes somewhat of a symbol for the 12 tribes. Of course, the southern tribes are Judah, the northern tribes are called Israel, but you could see why there might be a second name for Israel, since they're collectively all called Israel. And in the prophets, you'll see the use of the word Ephraim to refer to the northern tribes. So that's one way that it's fulfilled later. It's good to know because hopefully you've memorized the 12 sons of Jacob. Maybe there's a song ringing in your head. That's how I remember them. The 12 sons, but now we've got 13 tribes. And of course, why is it that there's not 13 tribes in this day that have territory?
Levi has cities.
Right, Levi is going to not receive a portion of land because God says, I am your portion. You are the priests, and so you've received me as your inheritance that they get to minister to God himself. Okay? So we may come back to this map a bit with a couple more questions. In what sense is Jacob's statement in Genesis 48:22 true? Notice what he said. The very end of chapter 48, I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. In what sense is that true? Has Jacob been up in the promised land, capturing the land for everyone with his sword and his bow? No, we haven't seen any stories like that. It's, some might point to the story of Shechem, where they did sack that city as a result of the deception of Simeon and Levi, but that wasn't Jacob's doing. He didn't want any part of it. So, in what sense is this true, Norm?
One of the interesting things about God and his way he looks at time and prophecy and things, when God says it's going to be done, it's done. It's already done. Even though it hasn't, in our lives, it hasn't been done yet, it's done. And so when you look at prophecy and things like that, you have to consider it's God's, in God's time. And we're, as a matter of fact, in the New Testament, as we're told to pray, we're told to pray as if it has already happened.
Yeah.
In faith. And so again, it kind of correlates with the same God. He operates the same way, Old Testament, New Testament.
Sure. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? We've seen even the progression of Jacob's faith, and this just has to be paramount to me, to be able to speak in past tense about the things that he knows that God is going to do. He's at the very end of his life. He's about to bless his 12 sons and then pull his feet into the bed and expire. And he is now seeing the blessings of God, the promises of God, as fulfilled. And we see in Hebrews 11, it says, these all died having not received the promises, but they what? They welcomed them from afar in faith. And that is faith. It's an example of prophecy after the fact. I'm not sure if that's how this would be referred to, but it's just the idea of speaking about something in the future as if it's done already. So that's the only sense that would be true. Okay, any other questions or thoughts from lesson 23? All right, so chapter 49 is, of course, the gathering of the 12 sons together, and they are now going to be blessed by their father before he dies. And I mentioned that these symbols somewhat help us as we look through these blessings. There's a lot of information in here, and you see a poetic blessing of each son, and you see some prophecy therein. So just like these men are called patriarchs, typically, we noted how in some places, like in the Psalms, they're referred to as prophets. And so there is a level of inspiration given to these men to be able to speak the future as given by God. So let's look at some of these in a little more detail. It starts with Reuben, the oldest. So let me have a few people join in the reading today. Let's see. Sam, you want to start verses 3 and 4 in chapter 49?
Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence. Because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch.
Okay, thank you. So in what way, I asked, in what way does Reuben, in a sense, become like Esau? What's a parallel you might point out to there?
He gave up his birthright.
He gave up his birthright. In Esau's case, it was for a single meal. He profaned his birthright. Reuben probably didn't know what he was doing, didn't know what the impact might be, but he, the oldest, should have received the birthright, and here's the reason why he's going to lose it. Flip over to 1 Chronicles 5, and you'll see another reference to this. 1 Chronicles 5. Do you have that, Brent? Verse 1.
sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, because he defiled his father's bed. And his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he is not enrolled in the genealogy according to the birthright.
Okay.
Right, so it's very specifically stated there. Like we noted, it wasn't specifically mentioned in Genesis about the birthright being transferred, but you saw it in the giving of the blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh. And so here it's this idea that he defiled his father's bed. What was the story about that?
He took Bilhah.
Yeah, he took Bilhah, which was...
Rachel's handmaid, or was it Leah's handmaid? I believe it was Leah's handmaid. And so that obviously was his father's wife. And so that's not, it's a very brief statement in one of the prior chapters, just one verse stating that, and it feels random at the time, like, oh, that's disappointing, that's not a good example. But you see now kind of why those details are placed in the story. It's explaining to Israel why things are the way they are. Reuben is not, even though he's the oldest, he's not the one with the birthright. And so he's lost something that he did deserve. This idea of the water as the symbol for his people, what does it say about him? It says he's uncontrolled as water. What's the danger in being a person like that?
Well, that's not a good leadership characteristic. So you wouldn't want them in charge, and him being the firstborn, he would have been the one in charge. So again, we see God at work here in removing the unworthy leader, replacing it with his own.
Yeah. Jesse?
So the New King James says unstable as water,
Okay.
and one commentator said easily overcome by temptation and rushing headlong into iniquity. His virtue was unstable. Quite a contrast with Joseph and how he was not easily overcome by temptation and his resistance to it. Another thing that stood out to me, what you were saying earlier about Reuben, how long ago this was. Well, Jacob never forgot it. Obviously, it mattered greatly to his father what he did with Bilhah, and it mattered greatly to God, as these are very prophetic blessings that he's bestowing upon his sons, and how that strips him of his birthright, though he's the oldest, because of that great iniquity.
Yeah.
The consequences, the rippling effects still, all these years later, being brought up at his deathbed.
That's right. Yeah,
It calls to mind a few places in our Bibles, right, that, everything comes with us to judgment, every secret thing. We need to remember that the Lord does not forget just because it was a long time in the past. In Numbers 32, it says, be sure your sins will find you out, right? And so it said back when Reuben committed that crime, it said that Israel or Jacob knew it. He knew about it. And so here it has its result. Yeah, this idea of being uncontrolled, of course, we're commanded to have self-control. And I hadn't noticed that contrast, but of course Joseph is one that we hold up as such a great example in the case with Potiphar's wife, as one who did have self-control. And that makes him such a great leader for the family. So we've got to try to not be like Reuben in that way. Now, that doesn't mean he's just another example of a leader in Israel who had committed sin. And you see other good qualities from Reuben, right? He did not want Joseph to be killed or even sold. So certainly not an evil man, but perhaps not a good leader because of that. All right. Melissa, would you like to read verses back in Genesis 49? Let's look at the blessing on Simeon and Levi, verses 5 through 7.
Genesis 49, 5 through 7. We'll talk about a couple of questions here.
Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their counsel, but my glory be united with their assembly. Because in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel.
All right.
So there's a reference here to the two as a pair, right? They're blessed as a pair and somewhat cursed in a way as a pair. What was it that they had done together to deserve this grouping?
Yeah.
They slaughtered the people of Shechem because of the sin against Dinah.
Right. Yeah.
Dinah
Dinah.
had been raped and taken, right? She was still with the prince when they sacked the city. And so then when the prince wants to take her in marriage, they're not having it, right? Jacob was more intent on maintaining peace with the surrounding peoples, but Simeon and Levi go in and exact their revenge, right? They convinced the entire town to be circumcised, and then it says while they were in their pain, they come in and killed every man and took a number of things from the city. And so, when Jacob rebukes them, what do they say in response?
You remember?
Shall they treat our sister this way or something to that effect?
Yeah. Shall they treat our sister as a harlot?
So they were a little surprised by their father's lack of leadership. Something should have been done, but no, not this. So you can imagine Jacob blessing his sons and thinking about who he can trust in his family to continue to lead. This is certainly, if nothing else, an act of insubordination, where there's no desire to know what does our Father want us to do in this case. And so he sees them as those who you should not be united with. Look at what it says in verse 6. Let my soul not enter into their counsel. Let not my glory be united with their assembly. Right? These aren't people that I even want to receive counsel from because they're hot-headed. They're wanting revenge. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce. Verse 7. So yeah, they're grouped together as a pair, Simeon and Levi. And then it's an interesting fulfillment of what's stated here. It says, verse 7, that I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. And so you think about these two tribes. How do we see Simeon? I put it as question A today. How do we see Simeon scattered in Israel?
We're part of Judah. Their land where they settled was in part of Judah's territory.
Yeah.
That's right. When Joshua is dividing up the land, a lot of times, the land that he's giving to certain tribes is, from this river to this, borderline or whatever it is to this sea. But here, when he talks about Simeon, he's giving them cities. I'll give you these cities. Did I make a mistake?
Joshua 19. You said Judges.
Should be,
I have a lot of typos in this one, guys. I'm sorry.
Thank you for catching that. So if you're flipping over there, look at Joshua 19, where the land is being divided. Joshua 19, 1 through 9. And so they're given land, but it's this land that's within, it says verse 1, Joshua 19, verse 1, their inheritance was in the midst of the inheritance of the sons of Judah. And then verse 9, it says the inheritance of the sons of Simeon was taken from the portion of the sons of Judah. And you'll even see as they have the now responsibility to wipe out the Canaanites in the land, those two kind of team up, where Judah says to Simeon and Simeon says to Judah, if you'll help me wipe out the people in my territory, I'll help you wipe out the people in your territory. So they're blended from the very beginning. And so Simeon, it says, is dispersed in Judah. If we go back to our map, you can see how it's usually shown as kind of a chunk of Judah, because Judah goes farther south, east, west, and north. And so Simeon is going to be somewhat absorbed in that way, because they just talk about the southern two tribes, right? And it's Simeon as a part of Judah. So that's fulfilled. And then how do we see Levi scattered in Israel? This one
Maybe a little more obvious to us.
Yeah.
They're the priests, so they have, they're giving cities in everybody's territory as the priest.
That's right.
Yeah, 48 cities are given to them. And the idea there is you're not going to own land. Yes, you're given some cities and maybe some of the surrounding farmland of that city, but they're not given a specific territory. So it's because of this, right? Now theirs is a position of honor, as we're going to see. The gift of the priesthood is a significant blessing, but it does also at the same time fulfill this idea of being scattered in Israel. Any other thoughts on that? All right, so let's look at the prophecy and blessing on Judah. Dad and Mom, if you don't mind, Dad, if you can take 8 through 9, Genesis 48, 8 through 9, and Mom 10 through 12.
Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Excuse me. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp from the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him?
The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people, binding his donkey to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk.
All right.
So this is perhaps the one that we would remember from the list of the 12 blessings, because you do see some obvious prophecy in this promise. And it's here that we find out where the messianic line is going to flow from, right? So question 3, how is this blessing of Judah prophetic? What do you see
here that's prophetic?
The statement, until Shiloh comes.
Until Shiloh comes. That one stands out, no doubt.
And what does that word mean?
English Standard Version says until tribute shall come, or till tribute comes to him.
Till tribute
comes to him. That's interesting. Yeah, I'd like to know more about that. Because the word Shiloh simply means what? It's the idea of peace. You see a real close connection to that word shalom, right, that we hear even to this day. And so it's the idea of a place of peace. And there is going to be a city in Israel called Shiloh, right? That's going to be actually the first place where the tabernacle comes to rest in the promised land. However, Brother Waldron pointed out, that's short term, doesn't last too long, and that city's eventually wiped out. There's no eventual connection to any of the rest of God's plan. So that's probably not what this is referencing, that the scepter would only stay with Judah until perhaps that town had the tabernacle there. So that's probably not the connection. So this idea of until Shiloh, or this peace, or this Prince of Peace, is the likely reference, a reference to Jesus himself, who is, of course, referred to as a Prince of Peace in Isaiah and, of course, in his lifetime. Is there any thoughts on that, Sam?
Quite a few in verse 10, but right under that, when it says, to him shall be the obedience of the peoples.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's pretty evident, pretty obvious with how the structure, how God wants, his kingdom and the people within it to live.
Right. And we naturally think
All the way ahead to Christ. But this is a family, right, with just a few people as they're just entering into Egypt, or having been there maybe now for a couple of decades. And this is suggesting that this family is going to have kings come from it, right? So at the most basic level, you see that there are going to be kings from the tribe of Judah. And it's going to be obviously fulfilled with that first king being who?
Saul.
the first king in
Saul.
in their land is Saul, and that's
From which tribe? from Benjamin. So then the kingship is taken away from Saul and given to David, David being from the tribe of Judah. So what does it say about the kingship here?
What's the symbol of the king?
Scepter.
The scepter shall not depart.
From Judah. So it's not saying that only Judah would ever bear the scepter, but that it would not depart from him. And that's exactly what takes place, where it starts with Benjamin, then it goes to Judah, and that's it. The true king that God had selected would always be from the tribe of Judah. And then, of course, it is emphasized to us that Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. What are some of the references that you might think of about Jesus?
Of course, we have both genealogies. We have the
Genealogy in Matthew and in Luke, which some have said because there are differences in the genealogies. One may be Joseph, his adopted father, but the legal father to a Jew comes through Judah, comes through David. And then the other in the book of Luke, which may be written more to a Gentile audience that would be more concerned about the bloodline, also through Judah, also through David. So he's from Judah. But then look over in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 5. In the image of the throne room in heaven that John's able to witness himself, Revelation 5:5 says, one of the elders said to me, of course this is one of the elders around the throne of God, said, "Stop weeping. Behold, the Lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome so as to open the book and its 7 seals." And notice verse 6 as well, "And I saw between the throne with the 4 living creatures and the elders a lamb, standing as if slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes." And so he doesn't see a lion, does he? He sees a lamb. It's an interesting use of words here, but notice the lion. Did you see that in the prophecy as well? So Judah is a lion's whelp. What's a whelp? I had to look that up. What was that?
Yeah, it's a cub. It's just another word for a lion's cub. So it's a lion's cub.
So that, also implies kind of a youth, which that applies very well to David, who was a youth when he was chosen as a king, and Jesus himself, who from his youth, of course, is the anointed Messiah. But this lion is just, as continues through history, this symbol of kingship. And so Christ is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So whereas there were many all the way through, and this tribe perhaps is known, and if these became crests in some ways, they might boldly and proudly wear this badge of a lion. It is Jesus who is the lion. What else do you see that's prophetic about the tribe of Judah?
In verse 8, it says, "Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies," and it's very reminiscent of the Genesis 3:15, when God is speaking to Satan. He said, "He shall bruise you on the head," with just that similar wording of Christ coming through them.
Yeah, that's great.
So it's certainly a position of dominance over his enemies, and as we see the messianic promise being fulfilled and expounded upon, it's this idea of, like you said, he shall bruise your head, but you shall bruise his heel, right? A mortal wound upon the enemies, in that case, Satan himself. Yeah. Anything else that you gleaned out of there? There's quite a bit. It says that your brothers shall praise you. That was previously a promise given to Joseph, wasn't it? This idea that they were praising and bowing down before Joseph. That was in Joseph's dream, and that has now been fulfilled. That took place. And now there's a shift of the praise being given to Judah, and the idea that your father's sons shall bow down to you. And so we don't see that in Judah's life, but we do certainly see the homage being given to the king in the days of David, Solomon, on down, and certainly with the Christ, bowing to the Christ. And
To him shall be the obedience of the people.
Right.
But the kings, but then ultimately the King of Kings.
Absolutely. Yeah, that, you know,
you are my friends if you do what I command you, right? And so this idea of obedience to the son of Judah. These last two verses that are in the prophecy, he ties his foal to the vine, his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine, his teeth are white from milk. It seemed to simply be a description of the prosperity of this tribe, right? That they are going to see great wealth, right? These symbols of milk and wine being so abundant in their land seem to be a reference to that. So you certainly see a messianic, many messianic elements in the prophecy to Judah. We can go through the rest of these, and there's a lot less clarity, I think, on what these things mean as they give a blessing to Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, right? And it's because we just don't know as much about those tribes. But you can imagine how a tribe might take on a personality where Issachar is a strong donkey, Dan is like a serpent in the way, a horned snake in the path that bites the horse's heels. There may be some fulfillment there in the idea of Dan being the northernmost tribe and dealing with a lot of conflict, right? And keeping foreign nations at bay, being kind of a border tribe. So many of those things. But one thing we did notice was a play on words. How does Jacob make a play on words in some of these blessings with their names?
so in the case of
Judah, his name means praise. So how does he pull that in?
it's the first thing he says, right? Judah.
Your brothers shall praise you. I try to remember that we've turned these things into names because we've transliterated names into English. But they would be speaking the Hebrew language when they say Judah, they're saying praise. So praise, your brothers shall praise you, right? And so it's a natural play on words when you know the language. Dan simply means judged because remember Leah said that God had judged appropriately for her. And so what's the play on words with the word judged?
Shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel.
Right.
And then you actually have in Deuteronomy 27:13, Dan's one of the tribes that will pronounce the curses from Mount Ebal.
Interesting. So you have the cursing as well.
So yeah, Dan shall judge his people. We noted Gad, and Gad had a difficult translation. That's our final bell. But you see this idea of a troop or a company is what his name means. And sure enough, raiders shall raid him, but he will raid at their heels. Joseph meaning add to me, and he's then called a fruitful bough. Okay, I'll let Norm pick up there with question 5 next week, and he'll be able to move then into the review. Thanks for your attention today.